What's up guys, I'm here with a Blood DK tanking guide for Legion pre-patch, patch 7.0.3. In this guide I'm going to be going over talents you should be using, your stat priority, your spells and abilities, your single target and AoE tanking rotation, and then just add-ons and macros that you might find useful. Let's go ahead and get right into it and jump to the talents. So in your first tier of talents, I recommend Heartbreaker. It's going to be what you're defaulting to most of the time. It just makes Heart Strike generate more runic power per target hit. So just more runic power, which is really useful because you need it for Death Strike, which is your active mitigation. Bloodworms doesn't proc enough and doesn't do enough at the right times generally, so it's just not that great right now. And then Blood Drinker doesn't do quite enough healing to match up to the extra healing provided by extra runic power from getting your Heart Strike buffed. So in general, just Heartbreaker, and that'll be your default choice. Now in your next talents here, we're going to be using Rapid Decomposition most of the time. What it does is it makes your Death and Decay tick faster, but it also increases the runic power you generate while you're standing in it. So it does mean you do have to be more careful about where you put your Death and Decay and where you position yourself, but it helps you generate more runic power, which means more Death Strikes, which means you survive better. Now, Soul Gorge, it's a really bad version of Plague Leech right now. You suck off your diseases from everything around you, and then you increase your rune regen per plague, and the closer they were to expiring, the more you get. The big problem is that it makes Blood Boil no longer apply Blood Plague, which means you have to use another ability, Death's Caress, which takes a rune, which means you're losing out on runic power, which means runic power generation rather, which means you're losing out on Death Strikes, and it just makes it a lot more complicated, and it's just not worth using. Now, Spectral Deflection, if a huge attack takes over a quarter of your health, which is pretty rare anyway, but if it does, then it consumes a second bone shield charge, which isn't the greatest thing, and it's just not worth giving up a consistent runic power generation buff of Death and Decay. So Rapid Decomposition for the second tier. On the third tier, Ossuary is going to be your go-to for now in this pre-patch. As long as you have 5 bone shields or more, the cost of Death Strike is reduced, so it means you get to spam more because it's cheaper, which is really, really good. And you get maximum runic power, so you can pull up a little bit better in preparation for big burst periods from the boss. Blood Tap in its current iteration, pretty bad. It's not like it was before. It's a 1 minute recharge, 2 charge system, and the charge time reduces a little bit every time you get a bone shield charge used, but it's just not good enough to make up for being able to spam more Death Strikes. And then Anti-Magic Barrier, it kind of turns your AMS into a mini Last Stand type cooldown from warriors. It gives you extra health, which of course does make your Death Strikes bigger during that 10-second period, but giving that up, or taking that and giving up cheaper Death Strikes, not worth it. So Ossuary in general going to be a choice here. Now in the next tier, Red Thirst, by and far the best one here. It reduces the cooldown on Vampiric Blood based on how much runic power you're spending. And since you're going to be spending quite a bit doing Death Strikes and such, it's really, really good, and you get one of your big cooldowns back up a lot faster. A Mark of Blood does decent healing and situationally decent, but it doesn't do quite as much healing as getting your cooldown up, which is better anyway for burst period. Plus it takes runic power, which means you're actually giving up Death Strike in essence to use this, so not really worth it because you're losing then the shield and the heal itself. And Tombstone, just not worth using. It takes all your bone shield charges away. You get some runic power, you get some a damage absorption shield based on how many charges you took. But the thing is, especially if you're using Ossuary, that means you have to start stacking your bone shield again. There's that period where you don't have any bone shield, so you're taking 20% more damage, which is really dangerous, and it's just not worth it. So Red Thirst in this tier. For your next talents, these are all kind of CC related and such, so it kind of doesn't really matter what you pick. Tremble Before Me is particularly useless in PvE, so don't consider that. March of the Damned. It just makes your movement speed thing break some roots and stuff like that. Again, not super useful in PvE. Sometimes you may get CC'd, so it could be situationally useful. And then even Tightening Grasp, not the most useful, but it does reduce the cooldown on your Gorfian's Grasp by a minute, which is decent, because you can use it on fights like Zul'Harak, so it's always kind of nice to have that. And then it also makes your D&D slow enemies. Your Death and Decay will slow enemies, but that's not super important. So mostly just for the fact of Gorfian's Grasp, generally I'll default to this in Tightening Grasp in raids and PvE. Now in your level 90 talents, Foul Bulwark is going to be your go-to. Every charge of Bone Shield you have gives you more health. More health means your baseline heal for Deathstrike is bigger, which means you heal more and get bigger shields. So it plays off really nicely with that. Plus you want to have at least 5 or more, thanks to Ossuary. So it kind of plays off quite nicely. Will of the Necropolis, not even worth considering. The area where it'd be useful, where your health is below 35%, is pretty small and a rather dangerous area, and you don't get as much effect out of it as you do from constant additions to your active mitigation. Now, Rune Tap you can take in certain situations. It's just like before, just a little weaker. Instead of 40% reduction, it is now just a 25% reduction. But it's still the same kind of use. You use it if you have predictable spikes of damage you know are coming, and you want to reduce that. It's not a terrible choice, but it does fall behind Foul Bulwark in terms of damage and sustainability for yourself. Now, in level 100, Purgatory is your go-to if you're on progression, if you think you could die, during the fight, possibly. It's really good. It's the exact same as before. So, 3-minute cooldown once it procs, and then it saves you, possibly. It gives you your healers like a 3-minute window and yourself to try to heal yourself back up. Now, if you're not going to die, if you know, like, hey, this farm content, easy, I'm not even, like, in danger of dying, you can pick one of the other 2 talents, because Purgatory literally does nothing for you unless you happen to die. Blood Mirror, it's kind of a mini 20% damage reduction cooldown, but it also redirects that 20% to whatever you target with it, so it's kind of a DPS cooldown as well, especially for single target. And then Bone Storm, it's a 1-minute cooldown, takes a bunch of runic power. The more you spend, the longer it lasts, and it just does damage every second and heals you for 1% of your health every time it deals damage. So kind of an AoE survivability / DPS cooldown, and it's kind of fun. So if you don't want to pick Purgatory because you know you don't need it, pick one of the other 2 depending on the situation, and have fun with that. Now let's go ahead and move on to the spells and abilities that you have as a Blood DK. First you have Marrow Rend, which is really important. It's your 2 rune ability, and it does damage and then gives you 3 charges of Bone Shield every time you use it. So Bone Shield, you've probably heard throughout my discussions of the talents, reduces the damage you take by 20%, and gives your haste a 10% buff, which is really important, which we'll get into a little bit later in the stat priorities. And then every time you take a damaging attack, it actually takes a charge off. So Marrow Rend's really important. You're going to be using it a lot, generating those Bone Shield charges. And then, but we'll get into that with the rotation discussion. Now, Heart Strike, it takes 1 rune. It's a cleave. They've brought it back from the dead, which is awesome. Reduces their movement speed by a little bit, which isn't super important, but it does generate extra bonus runic power, so you're actually getting more from Heart Strike, especially when it hits extra targets. And then on top of that, you also get extra runic power from taking Heartbreaker. So this is a huge runic power generator for you. Really, really nice, and it's a cleave. Now, then you have your Death Strike. Now, Death Strike takes runic power now rather than runes, and it's the same thing. It heals you for minimum. Now it's 10% rather than 7, and also, but it heals you for 20% of the damage you have taken in the last 5 seconds. So something you kind of want to build up to, like after a big period of damage. You want to use Death Strike then rather than say all the time or spamming it. Now you also have Blood Boil. The Blood Boil is now doesn't cost anything. It's instant. Has a recharge system, 2 charges. And what it does is it actually applies Blood Plague. Now this is really cool because your other option is Death Caress, which is pretty useless. And I pretty much just have it on my bars just because it looks pretty. because Death Caress takes a rune to apply it, whereas Blood Boil is free. Now, this ability is ranged, so there's probably some niche uses for it, but not too big into it. Blood Boil is generally going to be how you apply your diseases. Of course, we have our Interrupt from Mind Freeze. You now have Asphyxiate the stun, range stun baseline as a Blood DK. It's on a 45-second cooldown now, so it's a little longer, but it's cool that we have that. And we have Gorfian's Grasp as Blood DK, which is really nice because that is baseline now too. It's a 3-minute cooldown unless you take Tightening Grasp, which now makes it a 2-minute cooldown, and it works the same. Whatever you've targeted, when you cast Gorfian's Grasp, it grasps everything to that target. So it's like an AoE grip, which is really cool. And speaking of grip, of course, we still have Death Grip to grab and or taunt adds and or bosses. And then we have Anti-Magic Shell. It's now a 1-minute cooldown. Does the same thing though. Absorbs magic damage. Gives you runic power based on that. It's a nice cooldown. They did nerf it a little with that cooldown increase on it. Then we have Death and Decay. Costs 1 rune. Put it on the ground somewhere and it does threat and AoE damage. And now if you take the talent for it, Rapid Decomposition, it buffs the runic power generation that you do. Another effect it has now is it actually increases the number of targets that Hard Strike can hit, meaning when you're doing AoE, you put the Death and Decay down, and while you're in that, your Hard Strike now hits 3 extra targets rather than just the 3 that it normally hits. So it helps in your AoE. It's really, really good. And then of course we have our Taunt and Dark Command. We now have Wraith Walk instead of Death's Advance as a choice for talents for movement, and it just makes you move faster like so, and suppresses the effects of movement, slowing stuff. If you do any actions while you're doing that though, it'll break, so just do keep that in mind. And then we have our cooldowns. We have Vampiric Blood, which is now 1.5-minute cooldown rather than 1, and it does pretty much the same thing it used to. Increases your max health and the healing you receive. It's really good, really useful, and of course that counts for your own healing as well. And then we have Dancing Rune Weapon, which is kind of our big cooldown now, since we don't have Icebound anymore. It's a 3-minute cooldown, and it pretty much does what it did before, except it's now just a 40% parry chance increase rather than 100%. And of course, if you cast any abilities, it will copy them. Now this means, say, if you Blood Boil, you will now put 2 diseases onto the targets that are hit by that if Dancing Rune Weapon is up. And similarly and interestingly, when you use Marrow Rend with Dancing Rune Weapon up, it counts and adds double the stacks. So instead of 3 stacks per Marrow Rend of Bone Shield, you now get 6. So it's really nice. It's a really, really good cooldown. You just want to take full advantage of it, of the double abilities you're using while you have it up. And that's pretty much all you have as a Blood DK right now. Now let's go ahead and get into these stat priorities for Blood. So right now, Haste is by and far our best stat. It's amazing. It makes our rune regeneration go up. Of course, it increases our attack speed, which isn't super important. But the more runes we get, the more runic power we generate, and the more bone shield charges we can keep rolling, and thus the more death strikes and healing we do. After Haste, everything's kind of close. So it's not super important what you get. Technically, though, Crit is like a slightly ahead of the other 2 stats, just because it increases your parry chance for both damage and healing. So it's like decent. Once you get to about 20% or so, then Mastery kind of overtakes it. But it's technically Haste, and then Crit, and then Mastery. Then Versatility. Now Mastery is kind of the same as before. It's that extra absorption shield you get from Death Striking, and it increases your attack power baseline. So Crit and Mastery are pretty close together. So whichever you have more of is fine, and then Versatility is a little bit below that. But again, all those 3 under Haste, kind of close. So don't worry about it too much. But technically it is Haste, then Crit, then Mastery, then Versatility, and Crit up to just about 20% or so. Alright, now, as far as your rotation, so it's just another priority list like a lot of classes. What you want to do is you do want to have your disease rolling, and then you want to build Bone Shield stacks up to at least 5 because of Ossuary, so you have a cheaper Death Strike. And then after that you can spend, you want to get runes for Death and Decay, anything that you don't need. If you already have enough Bone Shields, Then you do Death and Decay because you've got extra runic power generation. And then if you don't have, if you already have D&D on cooldown or it's already down, and you don't need any bone shields, then you use Heart Strike. And that's how you use your runes. And then of course, to dump runic power, you just use Death Strike. That's your only option. Now, as far as using Death Strike, I mentioned it before, but it's really important to consider that you don't just want to be spamming it willy-nilly like all the time. Oh, I have enough, let's just spam it. You can get, the shield off of that, which is nice, but you're essentially, if you're full health, for example, and you haven't taken much damage in the last few seconds, you're kind of losing on about half of the Death Strike's use, which is healing. And you do want to take advantage if there's a big spike coming, like get hit by that spike, or take the damage, and then Death Strike because you'll heal a lot more off of it. So just kind of watch when you're going to Death Strike and consider like damage spikes and making sure you've taken enough damage to make use of it. So that's pretty much the single target rotation there. So keep a disease on, which is pretty easy. Just blood boil, boom, disease. It's free. No worries about it. Then build up bone shields through Rend up to at least 5. You want to have 5 all the time, especially before you actually Death Strike, because you don't want to waste that extra runic power. And then if you have any free runes, when you already have enough bone shields and such, Death and Decay, and then Heart Strike, and then dump runic power with Death Strike. Now, if you have literally nothing you can do, your runes are on cooldown, you've got no procs of Death and Decay, which you do get free procs sometimes from Crimson Scourge, and you don't have enough runic power to Death Strike, then you just Blood Boil because it's free. It's something. It refreshes your disease and it does a little damage. But that is your last priority once your disease isn't up. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate this a bit. And one thing to note, the Death and Decay proc is really useful. So when that's up and you have enough bone shields, go ahead and use that right away. It'll help you generate more runic power, which helps you survive better. One thing to note, if you don't need it within the first 3 minutes, or you don't think there's like a huge period that you must have a cooldown, you can start the fight and just try to build up those bone shields quickly, so you don't have to spend too much time on it. So I'll go in, put a disease on. I'll go ahead and Dancing Rune Weapon, build up 6 stacks here. Now I have a free Death and Decay, I'll use that. And then Death Strike, because I have enough, you'll see I have enough stacks here. Heart Strike, I have enough stacks. And I'll keep Heart Strike here for now, because I know I have enough bone shields. Now I'm getting pretty close, so Heart Strike again, but now I'm probably going to want a Marrow Rend, because I've just hit 5. I got a D&D here, so I'll use that. And then just kind of react to the damage you're taking. So keep your bone shield above 5 as much as possible. I got nothing to do, so I'll Blood Boil here, because I literally have nothing I can do. I'll wait for 2 runes so I can Marrow Rend here. And now I've got Death and Decay coming up, so I'll use that. And Blood Boil, because there's literally nothing to do again. And then here we got Marrow Rend, heal with some Death Strike, because we've taken a fair amount of damage here. And maybe I'll pop, say, Vampiric Blood now, because now I'm getting kind of low. And then just follow that rotation. Keep my bone shield up. I got free Death and Decay, I'll use that. Blood Boil, because I don't have enough to do anything else. And then build up runic power with Heart Strike, Death Strike when I can. And then just kind of keep watching this. So this is how it goes. You'll see, my bone shield's getting a little low. So I'll use Marrow Rend, Blood Boil when there's nothing else to do, and then Heart Strike. Now Death and Decay here, Heart Strike for runic power, Death Strike to heal, Heart Strike. And you see I wait till I'm like hurt a little bit before I actually use Death Strike, just to make sure I'm getting full value off of it. So I'll Blood Boil here, maybe I'll Vamp Blood here, and I'll drop Death and Decay to generate more runic power, and then keep going like so. Now see I'm about to drop below 4, so I'll Marrow Rend, then Death Strike, build runic power, and so it's kind of all reactionary to see like what's available, what's going on. Marrow Rend again because I have stacks dropping off, and then you just keep going. Now at this point, I have Death and Decay, so I could use that again, and that's pretty much how that goes. So you always react. You just want to keep your bone shield rolling, Death and Decay as often as possible when you don't need bone shields. And then of course Death Strike when it makes sense, when you've taken damage, when you need to heal, and things like that. And then roll your cooldowns as you do. Now you don't have to start with Dancing Rune Weapon, I will say that. I did that just to show you can get your bone shields faster at the beginning, but you don't have to. Especially if you know you need that later. But it's something to consider, like you get double of everything. Double diseases, double Marrow Rend, double Death Strikes. So it's a really, really big cooldown. that's pretty much it for the rotation there. And honestly, the AoE rotation is pretty much exactly the same. You prioritize D&D a little bit more, but that's kind of a no-brainer in a way because you want to have D&D up all the time as much as possible, given again that you have enough bone shield stacks. So pretty much the same thing for AoE. You want to keep your bone shield up, at least over 5 stacks. You want to put your disease on everything, so with through blood boil, and then you want to just death and decay. And then if you have any extra runes, then and your bone shields are good, then heart strike, and of course death strike to use your runic power and heal yourself. So it is both rotations basically the same at this point. As far as add-ons and macros, I'm not using any macros right now because nothing really lends itself to being macroed in my opinion. As far as add-ons though, I am using weak ores. You probably saw during the demonstration. I have both Bone Shield, the timer, and the stacks I have. So I make sure that I don't let it run out in case, I don't take that many hits. And as well as do I have 5 stacks or not. I also have a Crimson Scourge thing that pops up when I have a free Death and Decay. You could also use it to make, say, a Death and Decay timer, so you make sure that you can see, is my Death and Decay off cooldown? Can I use it now? Things like that. You could have a disease timer if you want, but you probably don't need one because you will run into periods where you don't have anything to do but Blood Boil, and it just reapplies it for free, which is really nice. That's about all I use and all I could think about. I've got OmniCC as well, which shows the actual time left on the cooldowns on your abilities, as well as, say, diseases or debuffs on the enemy. But not completely necessary, but it would basically just be for Death and Decay, or runes recharging. One thing I actually do, I do have a script to make my runes move this way, because they're normally stuck to your bar, and I will post it in the description, and if it's too long, I will just post a link to it, but it looks a little bit like this, and it's just a script, every time you log in, you have to click on it again, activate it again, but it just makes it go. For me, I made it bigger. So when you're looking at this, this part here where I have the scale, you would change this number to whatever you want, and that's how much bigger it makes it. The rest of it you can just copy. And then of course down here, you would change the coordinates. So you can play around with it a little, but this is what I use just to have my runes more accessible and more easily visible to me, so that I'm not scrambling for just hey, how many runes do I have left? What's available? Not as necessary now because we don't have different kinds of runes, but it's nice to have. So that's it for this video. If you guys liked it, feel free to hit it with a like. And if you want to see more videos like this, please feel free to subscribe to the channel and leave comments in the comment section. Ask any questions you might have, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Hope you guys enjoyed. Cheers.